Well, this is the next chapter, chapter 27. And David said in his heart, I'm going to perish someday by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines, the same thing he had just alluded to earlier. Saul will despair of me and not seek me anymore in any part of Israel, so I shall escape out of his hand. Well, this is a little bit more of David's self-talk, you know. We saw some of that last week. Those little reviews, those little things we say in our minds, and at this point it doesn't appear to be the healthiest sort of understanding of things. David says, I'm going to perish at the hands of Saul. Well, wait a minute, David. Don't you remember the promises God made to you? Don't you remember you're destined to be the next king? Don't you remember that, Samuel anointed you? What's with this? You're going to perish, David. Come on. Well, if we'd been there, we could have reminded him of that. But I think at this dark moment, he's been shaken up by the fact that the Ziphites have betrayed him. They had no particular reason that we're aware of to do that necessarily. He hasn't been taking any reprisals against them for any reason. And all of a sudden, it just seems like it's crowding in, I suppose, on David. And he feels like the only way he's going to get out of this problem he's got is just to escape to pagan land, escape out of the vicinity, out of the jurisdiction of Saul. So what do we make of this? One commentator put it this way: was this David just giving in to despondency and heading off for Philistine country when he should have stayed home? Maybe. It puts David in a position of compromise, duplicity, dishonesty with Achish, and finally the catastrophe at Ziklag. Even his own men begin to turn against him. Finally, he winds up strengthening himself in the Lord, but it takes a long time. I think that's where I'm coming out on this, that this is just not David's finest moment. He does have a few missteps along the way, and when he decides to abandon his confidence that God is watching out for him and cave in to the circumstances of the moment, he goes off and actually for some time is going to now be in the land of the Philistines, escaping there, offering his services to Achish, that same character, king of Gath, offering his services as a mercenary. And that's what David is. This is the chapter of David's life in which he and those who are aligned with him are mercenary soldiers. Soldiers of fortune, selling their services to the highest bidder, and in this case it happens to be a Philistine king named Achish. I don't know if you've ever read Machiavelli's The Prince. I suppose I've read it 15 times or so over my life because I taught civics and I always required it of my students. My favorite chapter in Machiavelli's The Prince is his chapter on mercenaries. He has nothing good to say. Mercenaries, in Machiavelli's view, are worse than worthless. They are the worst thing for a ruler to lean upon, and he has all kinds of anecdotes and choice epithets that he attaches to mercenaries. And I think maybe a little bit of that psychology did become part of the working worldview of David in these days. It does at least appear to plunge David into a period of some confusion, certainly some ambiguity, and we see the evidence of that clearly enough, I believe, as the story unfolds. David arose and went over with 600 men who were with him to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. So David dealt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each man with his household, and David with his two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he sought him no more. Achish, we met earlier, of course. This is the guy who was the king of Gath. He was presumably the king when David eliminated Goliath. We saw David being a little bit concerned about that the first time that he visited. Achish dusted him off that time as David was feigning insanity. David went back to Judah. Now he's here and he's planning a little bit longer stay, and Achish gives him a bit more respect this time around. But David is away from the place of blessing. That does seem to be the way David is viewing this. He has to kind of watch out for himself. He's not so sure, it appears, that he can trust God's protective care in his life when he's out, as it were, in the outback, out of the vicinity of Israel, out of the place of blessedness. It just seems like David has to assume a little bit more responsibility for his well-being than might have been the case were he still in Israel. At least that's the appearance of what's going on here. He doesn't write any psalms during this period of time. Usually we find psalms that are attributed to various moments of his life. Nothing from this period, but he does take some music lessons, we gather, because Psalm 8, Psalm 81, and Psalm 84 all are entitled to the chief musician on the instrument of Gath. A psalm of David. I don't know what that instrument was, but nevertheless, David did at least hone his musical skills during this time, and we have some evidence of that. It's also interesting that these guys are said to have traveled with their families. So David had his 2 wives at this point. There are 600 men with him, and of course, some of them probably had wives and children, so we can imagine this is a pretty good-sized group, that's showing up there in Gath, and it wouldn't be the kind of thing they would just kind of slip into town and not be noticed. And so we hear that David appears before Achish and says to him, "Now, if I found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country that I may dwell there, for why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. All right, now this is confusing in the version that most of us have in our Bibles. And it once again at least gives us occasion to note that the Septuagint version of the Old Testament was likely based on manuscripts that didn't survive down to the day that the Old Testament was translated in terms of what we have. So we look to the Septuagint sometimes to see if there's some insight here that may help us figure out how to make all the dots connect. And this is one good example where something like that takes place. David had apparently, now just putting this together, I'm just going to float this trial balloon with you for a moment, but David had shown up and probably initially offered his services to Achish as a mercenary. I'm here at your service. Tell me what to do, I'll do it. Send me on these military excursions, I'll do them. David was probably already a little nervous about doing that because who knows, Achish might send him on a raiding party against his own people, and David would have certainly been uncomfortable with that, But at the same time, he has to justify his existence here, and so he probably made that appeal. Well, he was apparently there for some brief period of time, maybe 3 or 4 months, and then he gives this speech. So this speech came a little bit later, not too much, in which he now seeks to move to a distance, a little bit further away from the immediate vicinity of Achish and his rule and his observation. David is, of course, in a rather uncomfortable and somewhat delicate position because he wants to appear to be loyal to Achish, and yet he hasn't forgotten his genuine loyalty to his own people, notwithstanding Saul's campaign against him. And so what are you going to do on that tightrope? David thinks maybe the smartest thing to do is to get away, get a little bit of a distance away, especially from the royal city where Achish rules. David's sort of implying here, look, I'm kind of a nuisance. I'm always underfoot. I've got all these people with me. Let me just get out of reach a little bit so that I won't be such a burden to you. He probably implied to Achish that he could guard the border, put him out there where he could sort of keep an eye on things further away. He may also have been a little bit concerned about the people that were with him becoming diluted in their own clarity of vision. Sometimes when you live in a foreign place, you start kind of taking on the values of the place. You begin seeing things from their point of view. And I'm sure he was worried that some of these people, who weren't probably all that sterling in their faith commitments anyway, might already be starting to drift a little bit. The paganism, the idolatry, and so on, it has a way of insinuating itself into a person's point of view. And so David was probably wanting to get these guys a little bit more under his own immediate control and not so much exposed to those influence. He certainly wanted to make sure that Achish didn't discover that he was kind of playing both sides of the fence here a little bit. For all of those reasons, David wants to get away. And so the place that is named by Achish is called Ziklag. Ziklag is about 50 miles south of Gath. So that's kind of a safe distance, you might say. Ziklag originally belonged to Israel. It's first mentioned in Joshua as being part of the territorial belongings of Judah. Then it went to Simeon, but eventually fell into Philistine hands. So now, in a sense, it's being given back as a gift, you might say, to David for services that he's going to be rendering. Well, the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was 1 full year and 4 months. This is where the chief ambiguity shows up. The Septuagint says this: David was in Gath for 4 months, not a year and 4 months. The year and 4 months seems to have been interpolated in there somewhere along the way, and it does make the story make a little more sense if we track with it this way. So I'm just asking you to entertain that, and you'll see that in some of the footnotes of your Bibles that particular adjustment is made. So the idea would be that David was in Gath for a few months, then went to Ziklag, and was probably there for at least another year and maybe more before the whole story is over. So, as I say, it is somewhat ambiguous, but it at least gives us reason to view it that way. Well, David and his men at this point went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. For those nations were the inhabitants of the land from of old. As you go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. The Geshurites are to the south. The Girzites, similarly, are in that region, but the best known of the three, and probably the dominant Bedouin population there, were the Amalekites. They all were sort of taken together, and they did have some interactions with each other, but the one thing that really distinguishes all of them is that they had been there for a long time, and that they had been the perpetual enemies of Israel. Amalek in particular had distinguished itself as those that had attacked the Israelites just shortly after the Exodus. They're just barely escaping out of Egypt, you see, and all of a sudden they're being attacked by the Amalekites. Amalek was a son of Esau. There'd never been any cordial relationship between them. Moses was so unhappy with the Amalekites, he included in the book of Deuteronomy an order that they constantly be viewed as enemies, that we should never make peace with them, that there should be ongoing war until they're finally eliminated. That's what Moses had to say about them. And that particular philosophy continued. So Samuel on one occasion had said to Saul, "Go wipe out the Amalekites." Saul said, "Aye, aye." Went down and wiped out some of the Amalekites. But he hung on to some of the best livestock, even some of the people. And that was the beginning of the end for Saul, when Samuel showed up and said, "What's that bleating I hear? And what is this kind of half-baked obedience you've done?" And that's the beginning of the end of Saul's being in the good graces, not only of Samuel, but of God as well. And so the Amalekites had been an interesting kind of thorny problem. And what we learn now is that David is seizing the opportunity to launch a campaign against them and those associated with them in this region south of Ziklag. Whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. Then Achish would say, "Where have you made a raid today?" Or "these days," or "lately." All of that would be a legitimate way of rendering that. "Where have you been making your raids lately?" And David would say, "Oh, against the southern area of Judah." or the southern area of the Jerahmeelites, or against the southern area of the Kenites. So, David is acting the mercenary. He's raiding those who had long raided Israel. He goes back occasionally, routinely probably, and shows up before Achish and pays Achish the produce of his loot, the plunder. And so Achish is happy because this mercenary is providing for him, as mercenaries are supposed to do. This is also David's way of sustaining the men who are relying upon him. It is also a time, interestingly, when many others from Israel are beginning to defect to David. If you read the parallel text that you'll find over in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, where we get a lot more of sort of the accounting details of David's career, it says this in the first couple of verses. Now these were the men who came to David at Ziklag while he was still a fugitive from Saul, the son of Kish. And they were among the mighty men, helpers in the war, armed with bows, using both the right hand and the left in hurling stones, shooting arrows and the bow. They were of Benjamin, Saul's brethren. So even among those that should have been the most closely allied with Saul, he's having some loss here. Other tribes are sending some of their best men. These are people that are later going to be identified as what are called David's mighty men of valor. These guys came to him when he was a fugitive, and really in this rather awkward time, and yet it seems that his ranks are swelling even at this point by these who are defecting to him in this way. Well, Achish would ask what you've been up to, and of course David tells a bald-faced lie and tells Achish he's attacking the Israelites. He's attacking the Negeb of Judah, which would be his own people. He's attacking the Jerahmeelites. That's a clan that was allied with the Calebites. That was part of Judah. He's attacking the Kenites. These were non-Jewish people who had formed an alliance with Judah and lived under their protection. So while David is actually attacking those who are the enemies, he's telling Achish just the opposite. It's a risky thing to do. There are spies everywhere, and someone might have figured it out. And so David, as a tactical policy, adopted a fairly brutal strategy. He would save neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, lest they should inform on us, he was saying. And this was his behavior all the time he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. The very fact that it's stated that way does raise a little bit of a question in the mind of the writer, doesn't it? This was his behavior all the time he was with the Philistines. Achish, for his part, believed David, saying he's made his people, Israel, utterly abhor him. He will be my servant forever. We, of course, view something like this, and I think we're rightfully offended, and I think most of us would have a hard time quite justifying. Even if these people were the perennial enemies of Israel, to, in these kind of raiding campaigns, go in and just basically wipe out the whole human population, taking back only livestock and other plunder that would be of value. It does offend us, and I have to say, I think we are all a little disappointed that David is doing this, but then again, we were a little disappointed when he abandoned ship in the first place, in a sense believing that God was not going to protect him as he had up until that time apparently believed that he would. He didn't want to take any people back to Gath where they would have been sold in the slave market because people talk, and he was afraid that maybe his real activities would be discovered thereby. And so he's eliminating any problem, any possibility of that information getting back to Achish. And of course, Achish believes David. The strategy at least seems to be working at this point. He believes David has burned all his bridges and that he is the faithful, loyal servant to Achish forever. So we're going to leave the story of David here for a moment. But we all kind of feel the stress, don't we? This is not a real happy moment, and David feels like he's threading quite a needle here, I think, probably. Commentators, as I say, split a bit on assessing David's ethics. Those who rise in his defense say, well, David attacked the stated enemies of Israel, doing the very thing that Saul had failed to do, the thing that cost Saul the kingdom. So construing it in the light most favorable to David, okay, we can make that case. However, you also have a pretty formidable case that's made in the opposite direction, that David is being forced to maintain a lie to his host, to Achish, who's treating him well, who's providing and giving him a place to stay and sort of protecting him at this point. He's creating a highly complicated and doubtful arrangement in that regard, and so here we have David in this rather complex circumstance. Well, it continued for some period of time. We don't know how long, but at a certain time, all of this was going to more or less hit the fan, and we're given a signal of that in verse 1 of chapter 28. Now it happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for war, to fight with Israel, and Achish said to David, "You assuredly know that you will go out with me to battle, you and your men." Now is a problem, you see. So while David is still in Philistia, the Philistines are gathering. Now the point here is this. The Philistines were always engaged in raiding parties. This little minor skirmish would take place on a virtually daily basis, and so this is a different kind of scheme that's being worked out here. This is going to be a major invasion well away from Philistine territory up to the north. And the hope is that the north of Israel, which has now become quite vulnerable because Saul himself has lost a lot of his ability to defend the territory of Israel, is subject to an attack on a grand scale, and this is going to be a great land grab. This is the Philistines hoping to just take a huge slice of that territory and own it as their own. So they're hoping for a huge growth in their own real estate holdings at the expense of Israel. And so this is a major campaign that they're putting together. Well, David now, sweating bullets, thinks, oh boy, this is my worst case scenario. And so he gives a very interesting sort of politic response. David said, well, you know what your servant can do. And so how do you construe that? Well, Achish construed it in the light most favorable to Achish and assumed that David was pledging his loyalty, even though you can tell the ambiguity of David's response kind of leaves a little bit of question about that. Achish was convinced enough, however, that he appointed David to be his chief bodyguard, the captain, as it were, of those who were charged with guarding Achish. Okay, so that's what's happening. And if you're interested in how this plays out and how exactly David is able to avoid joining Achish and going to war against his own people, you got to come back next week. That's the way it is. But if you want to read ahead, it's the last 3 chapters of 1 Samuel, which will be your reading assignment anyway this week. So there you are. Samuel had died, verse 3, and all Israel had lamented for him and buried him at Ramah in his own city, and Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. Now this is a setup verse. This verse is here in order to explain what's about to happen. Because what we're learning from this is that, first of all, Saul's access to the legitimate Hebrew oracle has been removed. Samuel, who had been that prophetic voice, giving instruction, giving counsel, giving indeed the word of the Lord to Saul, was gone. So the legitimate oracle is gone. To make matters worse from Saul's point of view, the illegitimate oracles are gone because Saul himself had driven them out, probably at Samuel's command. So we have legitimate oracles and we have these so-called dark oracles. They're put in 2 classes: mediums, not media, by the way, but they're called mediums. And they are usually women. They have what are called familiar spirits, And they were those who you could go and ask questions and you would get responses sort of from the dark side, you know. Spiritists were generally men. They were also called wizards, literally wise ones, people who knew the answers. And so you had two classes of these kind of dark oracles that were very, very common in the ancient world, but were illegal in Israel, and I might add as a footnote, illegal for Christian people. Both the Old Testament and New Testament categorically repudiate this as any form of legitimate guidance in the life of a Christian person. Some people have tried to use the story we're about to look at as an exception to the rule that proves that the rule should be set aside, but I don't think we can quite get there from here. So just get that on the record at this point. But anyway, Saul is, of course, in a bit of a pickle because he doesn't have access then to either side, either the legitimate or the not so legitimate oracular function. Then the Philistines gathered together and came and encamped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel together, and they encamped at Gilboa. Shunem, now I know this map is very busy, it's the best I could come up with, but Shunem is well to the north of Philistine country. So if you can see that there, the arrow is pointing to Shunem. Shunem was a little town, not overly important, but it does pop up once or twice in the Old Testament. Maybe you've heard of the Shunammite widow who provided hospitality to Elisha some years later. If you know the name Abishag, she was the young woman who cared for David in the last few days of his life when he was needing sort of round-the-clock in-home care, you know. She provided that. She was from this town. It was, however, the venue where the Philistines show up, because this is the general part of Israel that appears at this time to be vulnerable and subject to an attack. So if we blow this little piece of the map up, then you'll see that Shunem is right there, and Gilboa is down to the south right there. So the two areas are pretty close together, separated by a valley called the Valley of Jezreel. All right, so have that in your mind. It helps us kind of see what's going on. Well, Saul comes to Mount Gilboa, pulls out his spyglasses, you know, and looks across the ravine. And when Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. So Saul was presumably shocked, seeing such a large force, thought this was supposed to be another kind of minor invasion, and now he sees that they've assembled all of these great forces and put the north of Israel at considerable risk. Saul at this point would ordinarily try to get guidance from the Lord, but nobody's home. So when he tries to use the various methods that would be used, dreams that would come sometimes through prophets or others, seers, nothing there. The Urim and the Thummim, these odd kind of apparently stones that were associated with the priestly ephod, were in David's possession. And for that matter, Saul had killed 85 priests anyway. They didn't like him very much, so that wasn't doing anything for his PR. The prophets, Samuel himself and the school of the prophets, had been alienated by Saul's brutality. All of these that would have been the machinery that he would use to get counsel at this point had gone dark. To make matters worse, David is out of town, you know. So what to do? And Saul is in this rather miserable predicament. I like what one commentator said about the whole situation. As David gave loyalty to Achish, Saul was left to his own miserable devices. It's a natural human desire to get an easy answer to a difficult and sometimes insoluble problem. Even today, seeking the wisdom of tea leaves in their various forms is not uncommon. People still want the oracle. God wants us to let His Word dwell in us richly. That one line may be worth the price of admission this morning, so just tuck that away, you know. We are all susceptible to trying to get a quick answer. People look at their horoscopes. They look at all of these devices. Those are forbidden to Christians, really. We are not to seek the truth of God from those kinds of superstitious machinery, that kind of item in our lives. We are to be people who are so steeped in the Word of God that the wisdom of God is just there coursing through our bloodstream. Be students of the Word, and the trivial substitutes of this world will become pretty much in your mind as worthless as they really are. But when we're desperate, sometimes we'll opt for these kinds of things, and that's certainly what appears to be the case for our friend here, Saul. Saul said to his servants, "Okay, find me a woman who's a medium, that I can go to her and inquire of her." And his servants said to him, "Well, in fact, there is a woman who is a medium at En Dor." So Saul disguised himself, put on other clothes, and he went, and 2 of his men with him, and they came to the woman by night, and he said, "Please conduct a seance for me. Bring up the one that I shall name to you." So, women typically associated with this particular kind of dark oracle. Saul is in this awkward position. Orthodox methods have failed him, so he's now resorting to other means. Now, if you look at the map, you'll notice that En Dor is right there, and you'll notice that Mount Gilboa is down below, and that Shunem is right between them. And so in order for Saul to get to this Witch of En Dor, as she's commonly called, he had to basically trek right through Philistine territory. Now, wasn't that a sight? So he has to travel by night. It's a dangerous journey. There's always the possibility he could be discovered. It's a pathetic, sad picture. Here's the king of Israel. He's supposed to be giving mighty speeches, speeches that'll inspire his men, St. Crispin type speeches to his men to get them up for the battle. What's he doing? He's crawling on his hands and knees through the mud in a disguise, hoping he won't be discovered. What kind of picture is this? The more I thought about this, it kind of reminded me of a statement that the Apostle Paul makes in Romans chapter 7, in which Paul talks about the sin that dwells in all of us. And he says of that sin that dwells in all of us, it wants to become exceedingly sinful. We have a temptation, well, maybe you don't, I don't, I do. I have this temptation to always want to make little side deals with sin, Oh, it's not that big a deal. It's nothing, it's trivial, We don't really appreciate the malice, the hellish malice that sin has against us. It doesn't want to leave you in polite company. It wants to leave you in the most extraordinary state of brokenness you can imagine. It won't be satisfied till it has crushed you utterly. And here is Saul, once a magnificent character, widely esteemed and respected, now crawling through the mud on his hands and knees, trying to get to a witch to tell him what to do. What is this? So there's our friend. Well, he wants her to conduct a seance. It was illegal. It was against Jewish law. But it was lucrative, and so she continues to ply her trade in spite of that. He wants her to engage in what's commonly called necromancy, calling someone back from the dead, and to get some kind of counsel from that spirit. One said that Saul rightly drove out the mediums, but somehow thought he was above the rules. It's quite common for people to believe that moral rules should apply to others, but oneself should be exempt for whatever reasons. The willingness to intentionally break the rules leads to cynicism and the complete loss of faith. The fact is, the moral law is as immutable as is the law of gravity. Either will take a man's life if he lives in disregard of its demands. And we certainly see something of that in the case of Saul. Well, he makes it to this woman in En Dor, and the woman said to him, "Look, you know what Saul has done. how he's cut off mediums and spiritists from the land. Why then do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die? Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment will come upon you for this thing. I think she suspected a sting operation. She thought that this was a setup. Her feelers were out there. But based on an oath in the name of the Lord, she's given some confidence, and she proceeds. She said, well, who do you want me to bring up for you? And he said, Samuel. Interestingly, sounds a lot like modern practitioners of the same art. Who do you want to talk to, from the other side? Samuel would represent a legitimate source of truth, but Saul is seeking it by an illegitimate means. He wants that one who he used to rely upon to show up once again, but he's trying to access that one by the very means that this Samuel had repudiated himself. You can't have it both ways, Saul. It ain't going to work this way. We don't know what happened here. This is even more fun to read the commentators, because there are at least a dozen different theories about what happened at the home of the Witch of En Dor. And I'm not going to die on any of those hills. I'm going to tell you this so you just make your own judgment about what exactly is described here. I'm just going to report it. When the woman saw Samuel, or maybe allegedly saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. So was Samuel really there? Maybe. Or is she feigning excitement, as these practitioners would sometimes do? Maybe. She knows all of a sudden that this is Saul. Is this supernatural insight, or is she just a smart lady, putting it all together? How did she know? That is debated. I can't tell you the amount of pages that have been devoted to describing what happened here. It's amazing. The fun that commentators have trying to, split this infinitive. But the king said to her, look, don't be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I saw a spirit ascending out of the earth. So Saul apparently saw nothing. This was in the vision of this woman. She says, I saw a spirit. The Hebrew word there is Elohim. If you know your little bit of that language, you know that El is the singular word for God in Hebrew. It's kind of a generic word. Elohim literally means gods, plural, but can also be what's called the Hebrew plural of intensity, and thus was often used as the more exalted name for God himself, the true God. But it could also mean simply a supernatural being, which is presumably what's intended here, but it does at least create an interesting question. So, Saul asks her, what's his form? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he's covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. So he assumes this is Samuel showing up. The perception may be a perception of reality. It may be a perception of imagination. Interestingly, both the narrator of the story as well as the woman herself kind of leave the whole thing a little bit ambiguous. Obviously, Saul thought it was the real deal. He bows to the ground, and he wants the oracle. One said, Saul demands to see Samuel, and at least in that he appears to be a man of courage. It happens that people in such circumstances return to their past, maybe in hopes of justifying behavior that has led to an ugly current crisis. Eat, drink, and be merry appears to be the way of happiness to the present, but Epicurus, even he, wound up an ascetic, Any assessment of the past will surely show that we are living in red ink, and the only way out is not self-justification but forgiveness. The one thing that Saul does not appear to be pursuing here was really the only way out of this jam. Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Saul answered, I'm deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me. The Lord God has departed from me, doesn't answer me anymore, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I've called you, that you may reveal to me what I should do. Then Samuel said, so why do you ask me? Seeing the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy. Now the description here, why have you disturbed me? Why have you called me up? From a theological point of view, we're not quite sure that that represents the way this would actually have played out had it been truly Samuel. It does, however, represent the way things were viewed in that time, in which the death of people was followed by their descent into a kind of netherworld, commonly called Sheol. And so it's compatible with that view, but we would say it's not quite so compatible with what we believe is actually the truth of the matter from a clear-cut, theological perspective. So again, it raises questions about exactly how we construe this whole thing. Saul is complaining that the prophets have failed him, dreams have failed him. He doesn't mention the Urim and the Thummim at this point, probably ashamed at having murdered, 85. We hear at any rate that God has become the enemy of Saul, or as the Septuagint puts it, has taken the side of Saul's neighbor. The Lord has done for him as he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord also deliver the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. So the Lord has done for either David, or he might be referring to himself, as he had spoken through Samuel to Saul years earlier, delivering now the armies of Israel and Saul himself into the hands of the Philistines. Defeat apparently at this point unavoidable, and the implication is tomorrow you're going to be with me in this netherworld of Sheol. What do we make of it? I don't know. It's one of those mystery texts in the Old Testament, and I'm just going to leave it at that for your own musings. There's been a great deal of dispute on the question. Augustine thinks she conjured up a demon. Maimonides, an early commentator, that this is an effect of Saul's deranged mind. Many others, that the woman's own skill in the art of deception is on display here. Others, that this was actually Samuel. Was this Samuel, or the woman herself meeting revenge on Saul for his harsh policies toward her? The jury's out on that one. It's one of those texts in the Old Testament, fun to read, but this is no place to be dogmatic, in my opinion. He continues, on the whole, it's a sorry commentator on the depth to which Saul had descended in this pathetic state of superstitious despair. No repentance, no amending of ways, no preparation for battle, just a desire to look into the future. Samuel thus takes Saul to his past, to where it all began, and without repentance brought him to the present, where it would inevitably follow from it. Saul faints in hearing the verdict, a beaten man. You know that the woman there feeds Saul, sends him on his way, and the end of Saul's life, his death on Mount Gilboa, we'll look at next week. So I'm going to suspend our conversation here with 3 quick points constituting my Sunday school lesson for the morning. 1, David wandered from God's presence geographically and found himself in a place of compromise and ambiguity, but eventually learned what he would put in the Psalm 139, where can I escape from your presence? That may be the great lesson he learned, and we'll see that next week as well. Saul wandered from God's presence spiritually, not geographically, but probably wandered even further than David ever thought of in the wanderings of his spiritual condition. Found himself in a place of dark desperation and despair, but learned, where can I go to escape from your judgment? So my thought for all of us is any Christian may sometimes wander. There's that hymn we sometimes sing, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. We've all been there. we can have that impulse to wander. Hopefully we learn from both examples. From David, that God is faithful to bless even as we're wandering. From Saul, that God is faithful to discipline when we might be wandering. That God, one way or another, has His hand on us even when we've let go of Him. And for that, I think we can be very grateful.